That is some smooth smoke right there.
Bubbling good.
To the golden hour.
Happy 420, everyone! What a beautiful sunset.
You wake up with a plan. Today is supposed to be different. You told yourself you would finally start that project, make that call, take that step you've been postponing for weeks. For a moment, the intention feels real, almost powerful. But then something strange happens. The urgency fades, the pressure disappears. And before you realize it, you've slipped back into the same routine, scrolling, delaying, telling yourself, "I'll do it later." Now here's the uncomfortable question. What if that isn't just procrastination? What if it's not laziness, lack of discipline, or even fear? What if something deeper is happening, something quietly reshaping the way your brain makes decisions without you even noticing it? Because the truth is, for millions of people around the world, this pattern isn't random, it's subtle, it's gradual, and it's deeply psychological. Cannabis is often seen as harmless, relaxing, even helpful. And for many, it becomes a normal part of daily life, something that takes the edge off, helps you unwind or escape for a while. But what if that same habit is slowly changing how your brain processes motivation, risk, and reward? Not in an obvious, dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost invisible shift that affects your ability to act, decide, and move forward in life. This isn't about judgment. It's not about telling you what to do. It's about understanding what might be happening beneath the surface, inside the part of your brain responsible for choices, ambition, and control. Because sometimes the most dangerous changes aren't the ones that break you overnight. They're the ones that slowly rewrite who you are, one decision at a time. So before you dismiss this, take a second and think about your own patterns. The things you said you would do but didn't. The opportunities you delayed. The decisions you avoided. What if the real question isn't, why am I like this, man? But what is influencing the way I think? To understand this, we have to go deeper, past behavior, past habits, and into the machinery of the brain itself. Because cannabis doesn't just relax you in a vague, surface-level way. It interacts with a very specific system inside your brain. One that controls how you feel pleasure, how you respond to rewards, and most importantly, how you decide what is worth doing. At the center of this is a compound called THC. When cannabis is consumed, THC enters the bloodstream and travels directly to the brain, where it binds to receptors in what scientists call the endocannabinoid system. This system plays a major role in regulating mood, memory, motivation, and decision-making. In simple terms, it's part of the network that tells your brain what feels good and what actions are worth repeating. Here's where it gets interesting. THC doesn't just activate this system, it amplifies it. It increases dopamine activity, the chemical linked to pleasure and reward. Normally, dopamine is released when you do something meaningful, achieve a goal, solve a problem, overcome a challenge. But cannabis can trigger that same reward feeling without the effort. Your brain starts to associate relaxation and passive behavior with satisfaction, even when nothing has been accomplished. Over time, this creates a subtle shift. The brain begins to prioritize low-effort rewards over high-effort goals. Things that once required discipline, like studying, building something, or making tough decisions, start to feel less urgent, less appealing. Not because you've become incapable, but because your brain is being gently rewired to seek easier paths to satisfaction. And the most fascinating part, this change doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel like something is wrong. It feels normal. You still think clearly, you still function. But beneath that surface, the system that drives action, ambition, and decision-making is being quietly influenced, reshaping what you want to do and, more importantly, what you no longer feel the need to do. Now here's where things shift from temporary effects to something more lasting. Because when cannabis use becomes long-term, the conversation is no longer just about how you feel in the moment. It becomes about how the brain itself begins to change over time. And these changes don't happen randomly. They affect specific regions responsible for memory, planning, and decision-making. One of the most important areas involved is the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of your brain that helps you think ahead, weigh consequences, control impulses, and make complex decisions. It's what separates reacting from choosing. But studies have shown that long-term cannabis use is associated with reduced activity in this region. In simple terms, the part of your brain responsible for discipline and long-term thinking can become less active over time. Another critical area is the hippocampus, which plays a major role in memory and learning. This is where your brain processes new information and forms experiences into something you can use later. With prolonged exposure to THC, this region can show structural and functional changes, meaning it may not work as efficiently as it once did. This doesn't necessarily mean total memory loss, but it can affect how clearly you process, retain, and apply information in real-life situations. What makes this even more important is timing. The brain continues developing into your mid-20s, especially the prefrontal cortex. So when long-term cannabis use starts early, it can interfere with that natural development process. Instead of strengthening decision-making abilities over time, the brain may adapt in a way that favors short-term comfort over long-term growth. And again, the most unsettling part is how subtle this all is. You don't wake up one day feeling different. There's no clear moment where everything changes. Instead, it's a gradual shift. Your thinking becomes slightly less sharp, your planning slightly less urgent, your drive slightly more muted. Not enough to alarm you, but enough to slowly influence the direction of your life, one quiet adjustment at a time. At this point, everything begins to connect. Because when the brain's reward system is altered and the prefrontal cortex becomes less active, something very specific starts to happen. Not suddenly, but gradually. Your ability to make decisions doesn't disappear. It weakens. Not in intelligence, but in execution. You still know what to do. You just don't do it. Decision-making is not just about thinking. It's about acting under pressure. It's about choosing discomfort now for a better outcome later. But when cannabis repeatedly shifts your brain toward easy rewards, that balance begins to tilt. Difficult choices feel heavier. Effort feels less appealing. And over time, your brain starts favoring comfort over challenge, even when you're fully aware of the consequences. This is where delayed gratification becomes a problem. Normally, your brain can push you to sacrifice short-term pleasure for long-term gain. Studying instead of scrolling, working instead of relaxing, confronting problems instead of avoiding them. But with long-term cannabis influence, that internal push becomes quieter. Not gone, just reduced. And when that happens, procrastination doesn't feel like resistance anymore. It feels like a reasonable choice. What makes this dangerous is how logical it all seems in the moment. You tell yourself, "I'll do it later," or "I just need to relax first." And your brain agrees. There's no alarm, no urgency, just a subtle permission to delay. But those small delays begin to stack up. Missed opportunities, unfinished goals, decisions left hanging longer than they should be. And over time, this creates a pattern, not of failure, but of hesitation. You start living in a space where you're always almost doing something, almost starting, almost changing, almost moving forward. And the real cost isn't obvious at first. It's not what you lose instantly. It's what you slowly stop becoming, simply because the drive to act is no longer as strong as it once was. This is where it becomes even more subtle and far more dangerous. Because unlike other habits that clearly disrupt your life, long-term cannabis use often hides behind a powerful illusion. The belief that everything is still fine. You're still going to work, still talking to friends, still handling basic responsibilities. From the outside, nothing looks broken, and from the inside, it feels normal. But that's exactly the trap. Because the brain doesn't announce gradual change, it adapts to it. What once felt like a lack of motivation slowly becomes your new baseline. What used to feel like urgency begins to feel unnecessary. And over time, you stop comparing yourself to who you used to be or who you could become. You simply operate within a quieter, less demanding version of yourself. The most unsettling part is that this version of you can still function, just not at full capacity. You might still complete tasks, but with less intensity. You might still make decisions, but with less clarity. You might still have ambitions, but without the same internal push to pursue them aggressively. It's not collapse. It's reduction. And because there's no dramatic failure, there's no urgent reason to question it. You tell yourself, at least I'm not doing worse. But that comparison is misleading. The real question isn't whether you're failing. It's whether you're progressing at the level you're capable of. Because the gap between your potential and your current reality can quietly widen without ever triggering alarm. This is why so many people remain in this state for years. Not because they can't change, but because they don't feel the need to. The discomfort that normally pushes growth is softened. The pressure that drives action is reduced. And in that comfort, something important begins to fade. Not your ability to live abundantly, but your ability to push beyond where you are. Now zoom out for a moment. This isn't just happening on an individual level, it's happening across entire societies. Over the past decade, cannabis has moved from something hidden and restricted to something openly accepted, legalized, and even promoted in many parts of the world. It's in conversations, in music, in social spaces, and increasingly in everyday routines. What was once questioned is now normalized, and when something becomes normal, it becomes harder to examine, because if everyone is doing it, the mind automatically lowers its guard. It no longer asks, "What is this doing to me over time?" Instead, it assumes safety through familiarity. But normalization doesn't erase impact. It just makes that impact harder to notice, especially when the effects are slow and psychological rather than immediate and physical. This creates a powerful contradiction. On one hand, cannabis can be presented as harmless, even beneficial in certain contexts. On the other hand, the long-term psychological patterns we've been discussing, reduced urgency, weakened decision-making, altered motivation, don't disappear just because the environment accepts the habit. In fact, acceptance can make those patterns more deeply ingrained because there's less resistance to question them. Another layer to this is how cannabis is often linked with creativity, relaxation, and living freely. And while those experiences can feel real in the moment, they can also mask deeper shifts happening underneath. The line between occasional use and dependency becomes blurred, not always in physical addiction, but in psychological reliance. A habit that starts as optional slowly becomes something you lean on more often than you realize. So the real issue isn't whether cannabis is legal or socially accepted. It's whether the normalization has made it easier to overlook its long-term influence on how people think, act, and make decisions. Because when a behavior blends seamlessly into daily life, it stops feeling like a choice and starts becoming part of who you are, without you ever consciously deciding it should be. At this point, an important question comes up. Does this affect everyone the same way? And the honest answer is no. The impact of long-term cannabis use isn't equal across all people. It depends on timing, frequency, and most importantly, why it's being used in the first place. Because behind every habit, there's usually a reason, and that reason can quietly determine how deep the effect goes. One of the most vulnerable groups is young people, especially those whose brains are still developing. The prefrontal cortex, the very part responsible for decision-making and impulse control, continues to mature into the mid-20s. When cannabis use becomes frequent during this period, it can interfere with that natural development. Instead of strengthening focus, planning, and discipline, the brain may adapt in a way that prioritizes comfort and immediate relief. Then there are heavy long-term users, people who rely on cannabis regularly, not just occasionally. For them, the brain is exposed more consistently to THC, which increases the likelihood of those subtle shifts becoming more pronounced. The reward system becomes more conditioned toward passive satisfaction, and the effort required for high-level decision-making can start to feel unusually draining. Again, not because the ability is gone, but because the drive to use it is reduced. But perhaps the most overlooked group is people who use cannabis as a form of escape, not just for relaxation, but to avoid stress, anxiety, pressure, or emotional discomfort. In these cases, the habit becomes more than recreational. It becomes psychological. Instead of facing problems, the brain learns to bypass them. And over time, this avoidance pattern can weaken decision-making even further because difficult choices are consistently delayed rather than confronted. So the real risk isn't just in the substance itself, it's in the pattern it creates, how often it's used, when it's used, and what it replaces in your life. Because when a habit starts taking the place of effort, discomfort, and growth, it doesn't just change your routine. It begins to reshape how you respond to life itself, especially when it demands something difficult from you. Up to this point, everything might sound heavy, almost irreversible. But here's where the story shifts. Because the brain is not fixed. It's not a rigid system that breaks and stays broken. The brain is adaptive. It's constantly changing, constantly rewiring itself based on how you live, what you repeat, and what you expose it to. This ability is known as neuroplasticity, and it's the reason recovery is possible. When long-term cannabis use is reduced or stopped, the brain doesn't instantly return to its previous state. But over time, it begins to adjust. The reward system starts recalibrating, dopamine activity stabilizes, tasks that once felt boring or difficult slowly begin to feel engaging again. It's not immediate, and that's where many people struggle, but the process is real. The brain, given the right conditions, can regain its balance. However, recovery isn't just about removing cannabis, it's about replacing what it was doing. If the brain has been conditioned to seek easy rewards, then it has to relearn how to value effort again. That means reintroducing challenge, discipline, and meaningful activity. Things that naturally rebuild the pathways responsible for motivation and decision-making. Without that replacement, the brain can fall back into old patterns even without the substance. There's also a psychological layer to this. When people step away from long-term use, they often become more aware. more aware of delayed goals, missed opportunities, and the gap between where they are and where they could be. That awareness can feel uncomfortable, but it's also a sign that the brain is waking up again. The urgency that once faded begins to return, slowly pushing you back toward action. So yes, recovery is possible, but it requires intention, it requires patience, and most importantly, it requires a willingness to face discomfort again. Because the same system that once adapted to ease can also adapt to growth, if you give it a reason to. At the beginning of this video, we asked a simple question. Why do you sometimes fail to act even when you know exactly what you should do? And now, after everything we've explored, that question feels different. Because the answer may not be as simple as laziness or lack of discipline. It might be something deeper. Something quietly influencing how your brain prioritizes comfort over challenge, delay over decision, ease over growth. The truth is, the most powerful changes in life are not always loud or obvious. They don't come with warnings or dramatic turning points. Sometimes they happen slowly, through habits that feel harmless, routines that feel normal, and choices that don't seem significant in the moment. But over time, those small shifts begin to shape something much bigger, the direction of your life. So now the question becomes more personal. Are your decisions truly yours? Or are they being influenced by patterns you've stopped noticing? Are you choosing your path consciously? Or drifting into it, one comfortable decision at a time? Because the difference between who you are and who you could become often comes down to one thing: the ability to act when it matters most. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Not fear, not judgment, but awareness. The awareness to question your habits, to observe your patterns, and to recognize when something is slowly taking control of your ability to move forward. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you understand it, you have the power to change it. If this opened your eyes, then you're exactly where you need to be. This channel, The Behavior Lab, is where we break down the hidden psychology behind everyday actions, decisions, and patterns that shape your life without you realizing it. If you want to understand yourself on a deeper level, take control of your mind and stop operating on autopilot. Then subscribe, stay curious, and keep questioning everything, including yourself.